The Roman legionary relied upon his short sword, the gladius, and spent hours learning how to use it effectively. The historian Josephus wrote that it would not be wrong to describe their drills as bloodless battles and their battles as bloody drills. Men sparred with overweight weapons and wicker shields. It was a rough and bruising business, but it worked. And training like this went on from one end of the empire to the other. Before closing in with the sword, the legionary threw his pilum, a wooden spear with a long iron tip. When it hit a shield, for instance, the pilum penetrated and bent. It was then impossible for the enemy to pull out the spear. It often weighed them down, and they couldn't throw it back. In the centuries that followed the breakup of the Roman Empire, the infantryman lost his mastery of the battlefield. Pride of place went instead to the knight, whose armored shock was to warfare in the Middle Ages what tank attack was to 20th century blitzkrieg. He crashed through the pitiful infantry of the age and feared only his own kind. For sheer weight and hitting power, there was nothing to match him. The English archer changed all that. His weapon was the longbow, made of yew, often with a draw weight of over 100 pounds. It took a strong man to use it. His arrows, tipped with an armor-piercing bodkin point, were lethal at 250 yards. A skilled man could fire between 10 and 20 in a minute. At Crecy in 1346, as at Agincourt 70 years later, the English drew up their army in 3 bodies of dismounted men-at-arms and spearmen, each flanked by archers, who strengthened their position with sharpened stakes. French knights, eager to ride down the outnumbered English, surged forward in a charge which seemed irresistible, but they met an immovable object in the English archers. The chronicler, John Keegan, describes what happened then. The English archers advanced one step forward and shot their arrows with such force and quickness that it seemed it snowed. Bowmen let fly then at large, and did not lose a single shaft, for every arrow told on horse or man. So the knights in the first French battle fell, slain or sore-stricken, almost without seeing the men who slew them. It was not only the bow that brought the foot soldier decisively back into the battlefield. These 2 weapons were the other successful challenge to feudal cavalry, the long spear and the halberd, and it was the Swiss who mastered them. In the 14th and 15th centuries, they formed up in dense masses of spearmen who spitted the cavalry on their pikes. In the center of this thicket of spears stood soldiers armed with halberds, 2-handed swords, or vicious spiked weapons called lucerne hammers. These men stopped the enemy from penetrating the formation and then rushed out to attack him when he wavered. The wounds inflicted by their weapons were horrifying, even by the standards of the day. You can see the effect on this skull, recently dug up from one of the old battlefields. The Swiss gained a sinister reputation for never giving quarter. With the long spear and the bow, the infantry was able to regain its vital role in warfare during these centuries. In many essentials, warfare was now little different from in Greek or Roman times. But a new phenomenon was being introduced, that would soon fundamentally change its nature. From the 17th century onwards, the infantryman's life has been dominated by the firearm. Ever since, his tactics have been governed by its changing characteristics, and his training has revolved around the drills required to master it. On the smoky battlefields of the 1600s, the infantryman's firearm was the cumbersome matchlock musket, with an effective range of perhaps 100 yards and a rate of fire of 1 or 2 rounds a minute. The business of priming, loading, and firing was slow and painstaking. The musket was heavy, weighing at least 12 pounds, and had to be supported by a forked rest. The musketeer had to keep his match, a length of cord soaked in saltpeter, alight and trimmed. No easy task in wet or windy weather.
Presents. Fire! Fire! Fire!
17th century infantry formations consisted of a mixture of pikemen and musketeers, and they combined the fire effect of the musket with the physical shock of the pike. The invention of the socket bayonet made the pike obsolete. It fitted over the musket's muzzle, leaving the soldier free to load and fire. Bayonet fights were rare because one side or the other usually ran first. But they certainly happened, as Captain Charles Francois discovered at Borodino. We dashed towards the redoubt and clambered in through the embrasures. I went in just after a piece had been discharged. The Russian gunners received us with handspikes and rammers, and we fought them hand to hand. During the First World War, few soldiers were killed or wounded by bayonets. But for the Australians, with their formidable reputation for toughness, they were a favorite weapon for close combat.
When you're in a trench, you're looking all ways, not knowing which way they're coming. When you're with a bayonet and you're quick enough, you do it quicker than firing.
Right, fall in semicircle, round me.
Modern armies still use the bayonet.
We're running about that second there so you can all see the bayonet. The bayonet is designed to kill. When a bayonet is produced in battle, fixed to a rifle, the enemy, my goodness, it's got a considerable effect on their morale. Now today I'm going to show you how to kill with a bayonet. What's a bayonet used for?
Kill!
To kill what?
Yeah!
With what?
A bayonet!
Well done, fall in! Pivot! One thrust at a number of enemy. At the walk, advance! And guard! Da! 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 Any questions? Listening everywhere. Pivot! What's the aim? What's the aim? What's the aim? Listen in. On guard! Pivot! Front rank, one thrust and number of enemy. At the double this time. Advance!
Today there are still moments when soldiers meet hand to hand. A few Argentinians died on the bayonet in the Falklands.
Well done! Bring your rifle with you, son. Don't let it go.
Useful though the bayonet may have been, it was the firearm that really mattered. And technology has transformed it. It was the Industrial Revolution that changed the face of warfare out of all recognition, as indeed it changed so much else. The inventions, the improved technology, and the mass production of the 19th century introduced new, more reliable, more effective weapons. We can get an idea of the scope and variety of the developments in firearms from this pattern room. This is the Royal Small Arms Factory at Enfield in England, and there are similar establishments in many other countries. Here can be found a prototype or an example of some 4,000 rifles and machine guns from all over the world. For nearly 200 years, there had been scarcely any significant developments in weaponry, and now suddenly they came with a rush. From the flintlock musket to the rifle musket of the American Civil War, the French chassepot, the .303 Lee Enfield, the Vickers medium machine gun, the Bren light machine gun, the German Schmeisser submachine gun, and the new British SA-80. The flintlock Brown Bess was the British musket of the Napoleonic period. The involved process of loading and firing meant the infantrymen fought in line to deliver the maximum firepower.
Fire!
The thin red line was not just poetic fantasy. The rifled musket of the American Civil War had a more reliable percussion lock and fired a conical bullet down a rifled barrel. Yet the process of loading and firing had changed relatively little, and the infantrymen still fought standing up in line. This is Saint-Privat in northeastern France. The date, August the 18th, 1870. France and Prussia are at war. Lined in defensive position along this track is the 70th French Regiment. Coming up the slope, the elite Prussian Guard. They are met by withering fire from the French and blown away like chaff. Within 20 minutes, 8,000 men lie dead and wounded on that slope. A revolution has occurred in infantry weaponry. And the revolution is this, used by the French that day, the chassepot, named after its inventor. The radical innovation lies here. It's a breech loader. It means that the soldier using it can fire, reload, fire again, without ever having to stop or stand up and break cover, as he used to have to do with his old muzzleloader. And the effect also is that it has more than doubled his rate of fire. Moreover, this is a rifled barrel, and it's effective at up to 600 meters. It gave an enormous advantage to the defense. The effect upon soldiers attacking in line abreast was utterly devastating, as the Prussians discovered here to their cost. But tragically, for hundreds of thousands of men in the years to come, and particularly in the First Great War, many commanders failed to learn the lessons of this obscure French meadow. It was with rifles like this British Lee Enfield that the armies of 1914 went to war. Once he had loaded his magazine, the soldier could fire as fast as he could work the bolt. Some regulars could get off 30 rounds a minute at a massed target.
It was a great relief when they did start attacking, or they started advancing towards us in absolute crowds, massed together in crowds, and we opened fire and were blazing away at them. Well, it's quite a relief to be able to get some of our own back. Up to now, we'd always been at the receiving end, and now for we had an opportunity of getting our own back on them.
I used 4 rifles that morning. They jammed one after the other with a continuous firing. No aiming, just loading and pulling the trigger, you know.
The Vickers, a medium machine gun solidly mounted on a tripod and fed by a belt of ammunition, has been called the concentrated essence of infantry. The German equivalent of the Vickers was the Spandau, and dreaded by the British.
If you imagine a well-placed machine gun, a line of soldiers advancing, well, if the machine gun is to one side and they can shoot straight up the line, well, one burst of fire might hit a dozen or 20 men.
And when you hear the German machine guns, you'd wonder how they missed anybody. Not as they hit anybody, you know, squirming along.
We all hated the damn things because they were so desperately efficient.
Another threat was the grenade, an old weapon revived for trench fighting.
The early ones, you had what they call a fusee. They had a little wick on them, and you lit the end of the fuse like a cracker. Then the next bomb come out, it had on the end of that wick, they had a little vestas top, a match top. And they gave us a matchbox side pinned on there or tied on, and you just struck the bomb head or the vestas there on it, and it would start to fuse, see? And off she went. But no one held it much more than this. It didn't go 4.5 seconds before he got rid of it.
Both sides used an ever-increasing quantity of hand grenades. The German grenade had a stick attached and earned its nickname from its similarity to an old-fashioned potato masher. Some grenades could be fired from rifles. Yet more deadly than grenade or machine gun was the towering rage of the artillery. The sheer weight of fire which bore down upon the infantryman finally drove him underground. Now, this trench in Sanctuary Wood at Ypres has been patched up rather than preserved, but we can still see some of the features that gave trench warfare its own distinctive and ghastly character. The trench was a zigzag, and this was partly so that one single shell burst could not devastate a whole line of trench, and partly so that each bay could be defended if the enemy infiltrated himself into any part of the system. But struggling round these bays, carrying a wounded man on a stretcher, was a painful and exhausting business. Men lived in dugouts, entered by steps leading from the trench. Sometimes these were relatively comfortable, but their occupants had to live with the risk of being buried alive, either if the entrance was blown in or if the whole structure collapsed under a heavy shell. Wooden duckboards covered the bottom of the trench, while pumps tried to keep them from flooding. All too often, though, the trench was deep in mud, water and filth, and infested with ravening rats.
Everybody was lousy, and every time you went to the loo, you'd run your thumb up the seams of your trousers and crack them there. They were going off like a machine gun firing. And everybody was the same. We had the clothes for over 12 months before we had a change. We had a change at Popperinge. Easily 12 months after we'd left England.
This trench would have been deep enough for men to have walked along the middle, like this, without being seen. And on the enemy side ran the fire step, a narrow ridge on which men could stand to fire over the parapet.
There's a ledge behind your back. That's to guard your back, you see, in case a shell falls behind. But actually, it was your table. It was your dining table. And a little cavity there, you see, you used to make a fire in. They put a slight grid in front and cook on top of it. And you were actually supplied with coal and wood to make a fire to cook your food.
These rusty fragments are remnants of the mass of trench stores, rolls of barbed wire, wire pickets, corrugated iron, sandbags and so on, which were an essential part of trench warfare. They helped to make life barely tolerable, but they all had to be carried up from far in the rear by infantrymen, often exhausted, through hundreds of yards of communication trench. Big battles apart, the infantryman lived in his strangely old-fashioned troglodyte world. It had much in common with siege operations in previous wars. That hardy annual body armor reappeared. Steel helmets, some of them with a curiously medieval appearance, were here to stay.
The bright spots in the trenches used to be when it happened to be a lovely fine day and you'd suddenly see a lark spin up into the sky and sing its heart out, and you'd think, my God, don't I wish I was you, you know? And then, of course, too, there were long periods of boredom.
World War I was the epitome of the infantryman's war, forcing him to seek safety in trenches.